because in doing all this research, like I said, some of it's funny, some of it's so out there. But there's this one shot of this woman that always kills me. She's slumped on the side of the building, and her husband and I think both of her kids have just died. And she's like sobbing, and she's like, whoever did this, I hope you feel good about yourself. I hope you feel. And it's like, oh my God, that's just like so heart-wrenching to watch. And that always kept me from looking at this as just kind of like true crime, like sensationalist fun, you know?
It's weird to think too, and I totally forgot about this. I mean, obviously I didn't forget that he was executed, but that it was so long ago, 2001, June of 2001.
Right. Yeah.
Right. He thought the guy was going to come. He thought they were going to stage the execution, if I remember correctly, and that the guy was going to come get him. And, you know.
And if I remember correctly, he said something like that in the Ed Bradley interview with him. And Ed looked at him like he was crazy. and it was just like, the guy wholeheartedly believed, like, to the very end that it just wasn't going to happen.
Right. I mean, yeah, and what you have to understand with him that is not talked about very much is he was obviously traumatized by his experience in the Gulf War. He saw civilians get melted in Iraq by like jet fuel or something. He saw people killing civilians. He saw Americans killing civilians, and that stoked his anti-federalist feeling. Then he comes back, and Waco happens, and I don't quite understand. It's hard for me to get into the mindset of people that.
But he always credits that as one of the motivations.
He was there, like watching, like it was like it became like a tourist's hangout for militia types, you know?
Right.
And the other thing that you have to understand is there were 3 different federal agencies operating. So one of them, the ATF, they all had undercover agents operating in the right-wing militia underground. They were not working together, so they were often reporting on one another, unaware of each other's undercover agents. And their usual tactic was to go and try and egg people on to do shit, which is what I'm convinced happened with the Sarnoff brothers. So
the Boston bomber?
Yes. Boston Marathon. Boston bomber guys, yes.
The marathon bomber?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. Why are you convinced of that?
Because there's 2 dudes that were not radicalized. They were not very in touch with their Muslim roots, and they go to this Muslim group. And those are the types of groups, if you follow Wendy's research and the people before her who she was citing, that is textbook. In fact, the BBC documentary talks about this. One of them says you could always spot who the feds were because they were always trying to get us to plan terrorist activities and kill people. So, you know, there's a lot going on here with this case. And I'll disclose the MK Ultra connection. The person most in charge of MK Ultra is one of the true monsters of history. His name is a psychiatrist named Dr. Jolyn West, known as Jolly West. He was in charge of MK Ultra. Went on for decades, actually, from the 40s to I believe it was the early 70s, where they would be dosing unsuspecting college students with LSD to try to get them to engage in what they called mind control. This went on for a long fucking time. And the families who were suing in the 90s, like they got some sort of settlement, but the part of the settlement was they couldn't disclose, they couldn't talk about it. But there's enough declassified documents, and it's like incredibly scary, terrifying stuff. Well, who was Timothy McVeigh's doctor? Jolie West came in to step in. Yeah. So, I mean, this thing reeks of something beyond our ability to grasp, I think.
So
Was
I
he
have
a
a
loner?
no. Well,
Which is
as
rare.
as a person, yes. As obviously with that incident, I mean, there was at least one co-conspirator,
At least
if
one,
not
probably
more.
two. Yeah, because people at the rental place saw the other guy, and
Yeah,
like you
and there
said,
was
news reports.
and also I believe he and I think what we think was Terry Nichols were seen at like some lake resort where people, like, there were fishermen who saw the truck in these two guys in the days before.
Also, the level of explosives that it would require to like I remember there being something funky about that too, because like you saw the side of that building. I mean, fuck, like, you know, it wasn't just like you can't just do that with like what they thought. He thought they had a certain amount of explosive material. There was something else going on there too. And he didn't have a John Wilkes Booth t-shirt on or something.
Jeez, really?
Wow.
Yeah. Or I know he cited. I know he cited John
you don't
Wilkes
hear that
Booth.
every day.
Wow. How do you even find a John Wilkes Booth t-shirt?
I don't. Well, they probably made their own in that.
Yeah, probably.
People.
It's like, I'm surprised Walmart doesn't have one of those. You know how they got like all this retro stuff now, where they got like Goonies t-shirts and it's like Pearl Jam,
Hot Topic,
John Wilkes Booth. Yeah, Hot Topics.
Yeah, I mean, but you see, what we didn't learn from this case is you have to be super careful of this rhetoric, because now anybody can be tagged with that. Oh, right-wing extremist, conspiracy theorists. There's been so many years of history that evoke certain images of a certain type, right? That you got to be careful, because it's like, who are they portraying this way? To me, I am convinced he was approached by some covert ops superior, because he acted to the end like somebody who was just following, like he was just too comfortable with what he had done. I think. But then again, he's not the most rational cat in the drawer either. So
yeah, I think the rational, I could see it being a mix of the two, because I know there is a history and it's a well documented history of agents, because we could, I mean, the civil rights movement's a perfect example of this. There's several instances of this where it was like, okay, all of a sudden there's this person who puts up the money all of a sudden to buy the stuff to do the thing. Also, there were moments with the Weather Underground as well, where it was like, who's funding this? All of a sudden, there's this third person who's sort of just been around the group. All of a sudden, they have money to buy the explosives, and it speeds up the timeline of stuff. So it has generally been tied back to whether it is an undercover agent. Now, whether that happened with McVeigh, I don't know, but it wouldn't shock me, because there was, I know that one thing that, and this has been totally in government documents, PatCon, Patriot Conspiracy, where they were, where I believe it was the ATF was sending people undercover after Waco and around Waco, into white supremacist groups, and trying to get them to do stuff.
Wasn't Clinton pushing this? I got to brush up on my notes, but from what I understand, they were pushing anti-domestic terrorism legislation, right? Which
I don't remember.
I never quite grasp this reasoning because it seems like false flags are a long way to go to try and enact law. Like, I don't know. That just seems, it makes sense, but it's like, wow, that's going pretty far.
You kind of have to put yourself in the time period, right? So there were, there was all this rhetoric was flying around sort of underground. It's post the Berlin Wall, Soviet Union, the big red menace is sort of fading to oblivion. So if there's one thing you learn is that like the scope has to move to somewhere. If the scope is off Russia, it moved internal.
Right.
And then, with 9/11, it moved to the war on terror.
Right. And then sure. But I just don't, this is what I tell people all the time. And I say this to JB quite a bit. You make the mistake of trying to think like a rational person when you try to map out these motives. You have to think like an insane person. Like the whole idea that like COVID, I was just talking with my friend who initially he was like, Sabby, you're crazy. The vaccines, blah, blah, blah. He's like, well, how dare you doubt medicine science? He's completely flipped and he's a super rational guy. Interestingly, he thought the lockdowns were crazy, and I thought he was crazy for thinking that. I immediately doubted the COVID jabs right away. But on the lockdowns, I was like, dude, what are you talking about? Like, so he and I were talking because I was like, JB, I've been downtown recently. I was like, man, it looks fucking horrible. It looks like it's been gutted. It's so depressing. And Buffalo, the same thing. There are parts of New York City I've heard that look the same way. This like holocaust of small businesses, which, not to invoke that term, but and he was like, oh yeah, my dad thinks that this was done on purpose to take out small businesses. And I was like, you got to go a step further than that. I'm like, I do think I do, just looking at what we know, I don't think this is an accident. I think there was an intent to kill lots of people. But I can't think of this in terms of just pure rational motive, because if it's just profit, that doesn't really make all that much sense. It's like, what level are these people operating on? And the one thing I said to him was, I'm like, I said, at the very least, there's something operating above the level of governments, because if it was just governments covering their own ass, why would they force their own military to take this shot that they know is not adequately tested? Why would they force this on pilots, on police, on firefighters, on doctors? Like, what is even mobilizing to do that kind of damage? So
I would take that a couple different places. I don't think that there's necessarily some, and it's so interesting because this is where we usually have a different train of logic. I go back to the market sort of like directing us down whatever weird track, and you go in the other direction. And I think I think you had a mix of my gut reaction based on what I've learned is that there was a mistake, that you had people playing around with stuff they shouldn't have played around with. It got loose. And then there's this desperation of we have to cover our asses. At the same time, you had government sort of, holy crap, we have this brand new power at the same time.
Yeah.
And then you have corporations who sort of are in between the two, intertwined with both, because in terms of whether it's developing the vaccines or okay, why is Walmart open and your mom and pop not? If your mom and pop can't lobby, whether it's New York or the United States, to like, hey, keep me open, but Walmart certainly can. You know,